Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lisa Reichert. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Career and Professional Development Lead within the People and Organization Development team here at UC Berkeley in the People and Culture Department. And I'm so glad that you have joined us today for our Now Encore series workshop, which is Lead from Where You Are, a session about how each of us can influence change and culture no matter our role and title. And I am very excited to introduce our co-presenters, Dr. Christy Culpepper and Dr. Dennis McIver. Christy is an educator and longtime higher education leader, currently with the Clark County School District and formerly at the University of Southern California, where she spent over a decade in roles spanning annual giving, undergraduate admissions and outreach, and financial aid. And Christy helped thousands of students pursue their college dreams. She also served 2 terms as president of the USC Staff Assembly, advocating for over 27,000 staff and contributing to key campus committees and community partnerships, including work to increase access to fresh food in South Los Angeles. A proud triple Trojan, Christy holds a doctorate in higher education administration focused on sense of belonging for Black multiracial students, and she guest lectures on mixed race and racism. She also earned a law degree from Thomas Jefferson School of Law. Dr. Dennis McIver is a higher education professional with more than 15 years of experience. His award-winning service includes admissions, records, athletic compliance, academic advising, finance, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. A staff advocate and leader, Dennis is the current president of the California College Personnel Association. His past leadership includes being a Council of UC Staff Assemblies Chair, UC Riverside Staff Assembly President, and UC Riverside Black Faculty and Staff Association Chair. Dennis earned his Doctor of Philosophy in Leadership Studies from California Baptist University, master's degrees from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and University of Baltimore, and a bachelor's degree from Loyola University, Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Christy and Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. It's weird. I still kind of feel like I'm in school in some ways, but it's nice to be done as well. So thank you all for joining us at lunch, and very excited to be able to have this conversation with all of you today, lead from where you are. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Christy, who's just a fantastic person and leader who I've been privileged to know over the last couple of years. I think before we get too far ahead with anything, I did want to quickly talk about what our outcomes for the next few minutes are going to be. The first of which is we want to make sure you have the opportunity to recognize at least 3 of the leadership theories that are out there. And that way you're able to identify those that may resonate with what your style is. And we'll get to that in a bit. But then also we did want to unpack what it means to be a leader. And with that in mind, we did want to identify a couple of the different traits that are most prominently featured when it comes to great leadership. And then finally, we did want to provide you with a few practical steps you can use so that way you're able to exercise leadership from whatever your current positionality is in a way to not only positively influence your team, but also projects as well as the organization at large. Now, to get things started, I did want to provide a couple of comics that speaks to leadership. And the first one here speaks overall to a disconnect with your leadership style. And then the last one I did want to also share as a tie into Star Trek, my favorite leaders from earlier. It's not sure what you understand what we mean by next generation leadership. And the point that I wanted to make with sharing these is that when we're talking about leadership, there's a lot of different types of definitions and different ideas. And my hope is that during this presentation, we can unpack some of that so you can have a really good frame of reference overall about what it means to truly lead. And I'm hoping we'll have a chance to walk you through some of that today. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Christy.
Thank you so much. So how you can help with today um, is you're going to be asked to engage with today's content. So please add your thoughts and reactions to the chat. This is really, we want it to be engaging, informational, and definitely, obviously, transformational, right? So we definitely want to engage with you. That's, I think, are some of the best workshops that we can have. The next thing you can help is if you'd like to vocalize your comment, just raise your hand. And please be reminded that this is recorded. So you don't need to give your name or your title or anything like that. That's fine. And we'll be glad to call on you. We hope you'll join us on camera, but invite you to go off as you need to, or if you feel more comfortable being off camera, that's perfectly understandable. And if you need to stretch or take a water break, absolutely, please take it. We definitely understand that it's lunchtime right now for a lot of people or break time. And so we want to be, sensitive to that as well. And of course, if you want to learn more, you can check out the resources and we're going to share this with you afterwards, including the deck. No need to take notes, but the slides will be available later if you want to. But if you want to take notes, by all means, go for it. So let's talk about a few leadership myths that Dennis and I think are, pretty important. And these are things that we've experienced and maybe that you've experienced as well. So hierarchy decides leaders. And so I think that is a leadership myth because because someone is in a leadership position doesn't necessarily mean that they're a leader. How many of us have been a part of an organization or a team or an activity where there's certain people that just resonate leadership? They may not have a designated leadership role, but they may be in a de facto leadership role, right? And so that's something that can really determine the leader. So really the members of the organization, I think, determine the leaders. Management equals leadership. It really doesn't, right? We've all had experiences, maybe where we've had a manager that really resonated management qualities that was really there to make sure that we just got the job done, but didn't really value leadership, or that we didn't think of that person as a leader, someone that we aspired, or the characteristics they have that we aspired to have. So it doesn't always equal that. It does sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. Leaders are born, not made. That's definitely a myth. There are so many skill sets that folks can get that can really develop into leadership. Dennis knows this, but one of my biggest fears is public speaking. And I keep putting myself in positions where I do public speaking. And that's something that I've really had to work on. I am not a natural born leader and public speaker. It's something that I have developed and practiced. And so those are the things that you can really work on and invest in to become a great leader or a great speaker. Only extroverts can lead. Again, I am not an extrovert. I am an introvert. And so I can have extrovert qualities, but the way I recharge my batteries is by reading or, being in like quiet spaces. And again, public speaking is one of my biggest fears, but I've gained skills in training and going through leadership training and workshops to become a leader. So extroverts, we love you. That's great. Get those leadership qualities. But if you're an introvert, you can definitely transition or really develop into a leader as well. Those who talk the most are the leaders. That is definitely a myth. Sometimes if you've ever been in an environment where the person is talking so much and you're like, what is the person saying? And it's kind of like the Charlie Brown teacher where you're like, wah, 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 wah. What does that mean? What's happening? But have you also been in a situation or an environment where the person walks in and they just resonate that leadership, those qualities that you're like, you know what, I feel like I could lean into this person's leadership style, or what does that person have that I would want them to be a mentor, or that I could really gather some tips or some some qualities that that person has. And they may be a quiet person, right? Still waters often run very deep. Of these, which have you heard before and why? Are there any other myths that you've heard? And feel free to either raise your hand if you want to contribute, or type in the chat. Or if you're an introvert, you can type in the chat as well. That would be great.
I'll go ahead and get started. By the way, Christy, you're doing great as a
Thank
speaker,
you.
so what's up? But the one that I've heard the most was related to leaders being born and not made. And we're going to get into that in a little bit, but that's one that came up that has come up quite a lot, along with the ones that the folks who talk the most are the leaders.
Mhm.
And I see there's a comment in chat as well that management equals leadership.
Mhm.
And also, we see another comment where we've heard all of these in different forms, and also the natural born leader a lot. Now, to be clear, I think that there's always certain skills that you may have more of a natural inclination to, but skills can all be learned by anybody, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we head deeper into it. But Christy, I'm curious which one resonates the most with you?
I would say that management equals leadership. That's not always the case. I've had both experiences where I've had fantastic managers who were phenomenal leaders, and I've had phenomenal leaders who are not necessarily great managers, not always into those details. And then I've had management that was not definitely the leadership style that really resonated or positively impacted me. I see a comment here that says assumption that alpha personalities are leaders. Yeah, that is definitely a myth as well. That alpha personalities equals great leadership. There's some really great comments. A leader yelled at you during company-wide meetings that leaders are born, not made. He was obviously not aware of different leadership styles. Correct, right? That's not probably something that's really going to be effective. The yelling, that doesn't really resonate with me. Related to those who talk the most are the leaders. I've often heard beliefs that those who are the most charismatic speakers are leaders, but that's actually not the only or most effective way to demonstrate leadership. Correct. I agree. Because someone can be charismatic, but that is also doesn't necessarily translate into phenomenal leadership, right? In doing that. Any other comments? These are great. I'm so excited to read these. Thank you so much. Okay. Dennis.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about myths, and I thought now's a good time for us to actually provide you with some formal definitions of it. And I could tell you the first semester when I was working on my doctorate for this, that was one of the first things they had us do. And it helped to add some clarification. And I think as you see these definitions, it'll help you understand why it is possible to lead from wherever your position is. So let's go through three of them. The first one is done by James McGregor Burns, who's probably one of the most known scholars of leadership studies. And what he defines leadership as is influencing followers to act for certain goals that represent the values and the motivations, the wants and needs, the aspirations and expectations of both leaders and followers. So there's one definition, but we got two more. Another noted scholar of leadership is Peter Northouse, and he defines it as a process where an individual influences a group of people to achieve a common goal. And then finally, you have Gary Yukel, who defines it as the process of influencing others to understand and agree about what needs to be done and how to do it, and the process of facilitating individual and collective efforts to accomplish shared objectives. So we do have a couple of these definitions. And so we're going to pause here for a second because I did want to ask these two questions for everyone. Based off of what you're seeing here, what stood out among each of these definitions to you? And what is some of the common things that you're seeing based off of what's been shared? And you can drop it into chat, or if you are interested in speaking, you can do a hand raise. But I would love to hear everyone's impressions based off of what's here.
Dennis, I'll start. I'm a huge fan of Peter Northouse, And then the process whereby an individual influences a group of people to achieve a common goal. I think that's really, really important with leadership, and thinking about a group, right? And achieving that common goal and making sure that we're working towards a similar goal, I think is really important, which goes back to maybe culture and identity. I think that's super important. And I see some really cool comments in the chat as well.
Yep, we see one comment on working towards a common goal, and all focus on the form of action and implying that you don't have to have a formal title. And then also influences rather than just direct or push. I think all of you are absolutely identifying those specific items overall, that it's not necessarily something that's baked in, but it's a process, right? And I've one of the formal definitions I've seen has been it is a formal process of influence. And so I do see a hand raised. So if you want, please feel free to come off mute and give your answer.
Hi, yeah. I think for me, my name's Katrina, and I think for me, the styles that resonate the most are from Peter Northouse and Gary Uckel. I think at first glance, when I saw each of these represented, and I don't know if that's quite true, but it sort of came off like from the top to the bottom that like these definitions represent like a range of leadership styles. And I think when I first looked at it, I was reading as the definition from Burns being like maybe the most traditional or like the most classic form of leadership as we know it. And now as I was reading to like Northouse and Uckel, it read to me like it became there was sort of a shift in that understanding and leadership. I don't know if that was by design or just like my interpretation. And the reason I kind of came to that is because I resonated the most with the North House definition, but I felt like I do need a little bit more of that like Uckel approach, which I think can be a little more of a learning curve for me as somebody who, I don't know, leads or facilitates from a particular lens. So I don't know. Those are just a few reflections I wanted to share. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I will tell you that that tension you talked about in terms of one definition to another, this is one that scholars of leadership have been struggling with for a very long time. In fact, I won't bore y'all with too much of the knowledge, but one of the biggest challenges that's come up to that point is there a formal definition that can apply across all different applications of leadership? And there have been a few efforts to try to do that, but overall it's been found that that's not really possible at the moment. But there are some general framing principles that have been on. So what you've mentioned there is something that a number of scholars have been trying to figure out for themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that other point in terms of the differing styles later on, but I appreciate you sharing it. Any other reactions before we continue to move? Okay, continuing on then, the one thing that stood out the most for me is this idea of influence. And so I wanted to take some time for us to talk specifically about that because ultimately, one of the biggest threads you saw there is that leadership is a process of influencing others. And that comes in all sorts of different settings. But ultimately, the thing to know is that if leadership, in fact, is influence, then anyone can develop their capacity for influence. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do to build your capacity. Starting with, of course, the question, if it's influence and anyone can practice and grow it, how do we build that capacity in each of us? Well, there is a center called the Center for Creative Leadership, and it offered a few suggestions for individuals to develop what their capacity for influence is. And we'll go through each of those. The first one is developing and practicing your organizational intelligence. What that means is that there are formal and informal channels in which things can be accomplished in order to accomplish your goal or accomplish an organizational goal. That involves not only knowing what the process is, but knowing who the folks are involved to do that. For example, for me in my office, if I need to do certain financial transactions, I know the team to do it, but I also know there are certain people I have to communicate with in order to make sure it's done swiftly and effectively. So knowing how those pieces fit within systems is one very immediate way you can develop that capacity for being influential. Another one that comes up is promoting yourself as well as your team. I know, especially in the age the age that we're in, it can be very hard to talk about here are the great things that I'm accomplishing or the great things that my team are accomplishing. For those who may have imposter syndrome, I'll raise my hand, they can be also kind of difficult to talk about the things that you've done, but there are real benefits to doing that. Number one, it helps you establish yourself as a content expert, but it may also open the doors for other collaboration opportunities as well within your organization. One example that came up for me recently is that I had a colleague who had figured out how to convert a paper process to a digital one. And so when I heard that someone else had a similar issue, I was able to connect them with each other. And that helped not only other goals become accomplished, but it also helped to elevate that person as a content expert. But I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not been aware of this great thing that my colleague had accomplished. So being able to promote what you're doing as well as what your team is doing is a strong factor to increase what level of influence you have. Another one that has come up too is building and maintaining a foundation of trust. That your ability to be a trusted member of the organization means that folks will come to see and rely on you as different things show up. By doing this, you would just need to demonstrate empathy and you'd have to be able to strike that balance between what the people need and what also the process allows. One of the things that I've tried to do when it comes to building trust is I always try to frame my work as I want to find my way to a solution for this, but it may take time. And so, with that in mind, I always operate in transparency. I always communicate proactively. I do things with the idea that I want to make sure folks know that I can be trusted to follow through on what it is I set out to do. So, your capacity to develop trust will also develop your capacity for being influential. And then finally, connected to all of this, being able to build and also tap into whatever networks exist on campus also is a strong way in which to develop your capacity for influence. I like to describe myself as an island, a bridge that knows a lot of islands. And the reason why is because I've been able to interact in a number of different spaces in higher education, but also across UC. Even in some of my other roles, I've been able to have a lot of different people that I can tap into and that can tap into me as needed. And that's been super helpful when it comes to navigating certain challenges that come up because I have a number of different folks that I can work with in order to get to answers. So these are four immediate ways that you can do things from your own position, regardless, that will help develop your ability to be influential, which in turn will increase your capacity for leadership. Once again, we're going to ask the crowd, based off of the four things you've seen here, which one stands out the most to you?
Well, Dennis, I'll answer. One of the challenges that I had was promoting myself and promoting my team. As the kids say, I didn't want to low key brag. But I think that that's something that's super important to tout accomplishments. And that's something that I struggled with as a woman of color, saying, touting my accomplishments that I didn't want to come across in a negative way. But one of my mentors said, well, if you don't talk about the accomplishments that you've made or your team, who will? And so think about this as thinking about the talents that your team or that you may have that can also, as Dennis mentioned, help bridge uh, bridge those islands or connect those silos, as we often talked about at USC. It was connecting those silos and think about how you could help somebody with doing that. And if you don't share your accomplishments or your abilities, that may delay in helping people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Christy. And we do have a few different chats that I want to make sure we spotlight. One came up talking about how a colleague wanted to give credit, but they didn't feel like they needed it and felt a little uncomfortable. I think that's normal. It can be pretty difficult to accept the compliment. In fact, I was talking to my wife about this recently. She said when I get complimented too much, I actually get a little embarrassed. It can be uncomfortable, but I think getting comfortable with it over time is the best way to do that. And it's something you can work with just very slowly but surely. I'm trying to learn to take a compliment myself. You're not alone. We also see that leveraging networks also came up, and that's again really important one. Appreciate the shout out on a bridge that builds lots of islands. And so we're seeing a lot of affirmation that these are some common opportunities to continue to develop that capacity for influence. I appreciate everyone sharing. I'm going to go ahead, go to the next slide. By the way, we do have a citation for y'all, so you can absolutely read this article. It should, but we'll go ahead and pass it over to Christy.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Appreciate it. So beyond influence, what other traits do leaders demonstrate? When we think about leaders, what are some of the common traits or things that we think about beyond influence? Self-awareness. I think that's something that's really important. And I think it's kind of touches on what we just talked about, is learning how to take a compliment or understanding where we are in that position, in that organization, in that role. And then also when it's time to lead, when it's time to not lead, when it's time to think about bringing others in, how we can do that, how we can really come together to assist each other. Respect. For me, this is probably the most important one, because if I don't respect that person, it's going to be very, very challenging for me to see that person in a position of leadership or to think about that person and their influence. And that goes also back to what Dennis was talking about with trust. To me, trust and respect kind of go hand in hand. Compassion, so important. For me, servant leadership is really one of the foundations of why I serve, why I volunteer, why I do so many things. And it really comes from a place of compassion, and understanding that it doesn't feel like work to me. Don't get me wrong, there are days where I'm like, oh, this is a lot of work. But if I remember and think about the compassion of what I'm doing, working in education, be it what I do right now, K through 12 or higher education, what an amazing privilege it is to serve in these spaces where literally we help change people's lives. That's amazing. And having compassion for that and recognizing that people come from all different places in their lives, all walks of life, and having compassion and sensitivity to that is really, really important. And I love that. And when I think about ideal traits for leaders to demonstrate, compassion is key. Vision, right? Can't know where you're going if you don't have that vision. And leaders have vision, but also be able to convey that vision, right? To help us understand where we can go with that vision and not just say, okay, we're going over there. Let's go. Okay. What does that look like? Where is that coming from? Why are we going there? What is the vision? And so to share that vision, but also to include that vision and say, you know what, Dennis, you are part of this vision that I have. This is where we're going to go. And this is the part that you can play in it. I think that's very, very important. Communication, very, very important. And I think this is one of the key differences between a manager and a leader. There are times when communication is key. And for me, understanding, I usually like to understand the why behind something. Sometimes it can be annoying for some of my previous bosses, right? They're like, you don't have to always understand the why. But for me, that lays into the compassion, the vision, the respect, the self-awareness, understanding the big picture and that communication, but also being able to communicate it. And this is really key for me, the traits that leaders demonstrate in the style that the receiver prefers, right? So this is, does the person prefer email communication, one-on-one communication, talking on the phone or whatever that communication style is? I think it's really important to keep that in mind for a leader when they're disseminating the message to the receiver. Learning agility. Absolutely. This is really important. You've definitely got to be able to, as much as possibly, be able to pivot and understand and understand that this is a dynamic role, right? It's not always static. Collaboration, so important, right? Working together because we all have different talents and different traits and influences that we can bring. And collaboration is so important. And also, it's fun, right? To collaborate and think about those ideas and to share that information with each other. And leaders are all about collaboration. Again, a key difference between a leader and a manager. Leaders will want to collaborate because it's not about just taking that credit. It's about what can we do to work together to achieve this common goal that we talked about earlier. Integrity, right? Super important that we have that in our leaders, that we need to be able to trust them and that they do what they say they're going to do. And if they're not able to achieve it at that time, to say, you know what, hey, Dennis, you know what, I said that this was the deadline that we were going to have. I'm not able to achieve this deadline. I wanted to give you a heads up, but also what can we do to collaborate? What I need help. That's integrity. And that also leads to self-awareness and understanding that it takes a group of people to do that. It's not just about, well, I'm doing this and it's my way or the highway. Courage. Now, this is something that's super important. It takes courage to say yes, right? To go into that leadership position, to volunteer. It can be really scary, but it does take courage to do that. And it's something, again, that I sometimes struggle with, to say yes, because I'm a little afraid. But having a great partner like Dennis, he's my great hype man to help give me that courage to go into these leadership roles. Gratitude, right? And I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, and understanding the amazing role that we have in education and the gratitude and and we're all human beings and sometimes it can get overwhelming, but maybe to refill that cup or to remember where we are, to talk to that one person or that one student or that one alum, or whatever organization you're in, to remember why we're doing it and to have that sense of gratitude. It can really kind of flip the whole day and make it even better. Resilience, absolutely. It's tough. Sometimes you just feel like, gosh, I just can't. One step forward, three steps back, and can be very challenging. And you have to be resilient to be a leader. And it's not always easy, but that's why it helps to have a good hype person or someone that you can share that information with or bounce ideas with. And sometimes it's okay to vent. So one of the things that I had when I was mentoring some students, I would say, are you here for a solution? Are you here to vent, right? If you're here to vent, that's great. I'm here to listen to it. We can get into the venting and you can have that resilience. If you're looking for a solution, I can help you with that too. And so I think that's something that goes back to the communication and the compassion and understanding who the person is or what the goal of the organization is that you're serving. So to transition, we were talking about this, leadership and management. Leaders handle vision, managers handle process. So how many of us have worked with a leader and worked with a manager? And what were those experiences like? If you want to share, or if you want to drop it in the chat, in case you don't want to say anything, we'll be happy to hear that. Dennis, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had my share of folks where they may have been my supervisor or something like that, and they lean heavily into what is the policy or what are the processes that we need to follow. And that can be feel very transactional. And on the other hand, I've also had some folks who have been leaders who took an interest and exhibited individual concern for me and what my plans were and tried to be a resource and tried to encourage. And that always landed a lot better with me overall. And so for me, I've seen some examples of both, and it always lands better when I'm being led as opposed to being managed.
Beautiful. Anyone else want to share? I'm checking the chat right now. Okay, we'll continue on. We'll have other opportunities to do that. Leaders align, managers organize. And so align, oh, let's see. We have a comment here. Definitely had a few managers where things got done, but with no empathy or nuance. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And I think that goes into this next point with leaders align and managers organize, aligning folks to where your talents lie, right? Aligning to the goal. One thing that I've always found to be really successful in leaders is leading by personality, because there's not a one size fits all, right? What's going to work for me may not necessarily work for Dennis or for others, and to take those talents and align them with the goal. I think that's really important, where managers are like, okay, we're going to check off this box. Dennis, you go here. Christy, you go here. You do this, do that. Where that may not be where our strengths lie, but that may not be the goal, right? Okay.
I did see a question that popped in. What happens when you're being asked to do both? And I think it's a great point.
Mhm.
What I'll say is when I've been in moments where I've had to live in both worlds, I try to center it on some of those things that we talked about in the previous slide, compassion, empathy. I try to start with that and then see based off of this, having that understanding, what are the resolutions we can find that considers what we need to do from a process standpoint, but also what we need to do from a humanity standpoint. And I found that that helps a lot. And I also ask, how would I want it to be addressed if, say, I were on the receiving end of this? And for me, taking that pause and asking that question has saved me more than once because sometimes you may want to just get to an answer really quickly, but other times it may benefit you to stop and ask some of those more difficult questions before reaching the resolution. So I think slowing down, leaning into the leaning into your empathy and your compassion for others, I think is one way that you can manage it. It doesn't always mean it's going to land perfectly. In fact, there are some cases where you do that and it still doesn't work out nicely. But I think that's one of the most pivotal ways that you can at least try to live in both of those worlds.
That's great. Another way that I've experienced is to um, have grace. And, if we all have bosses, right? We all have people that we report to or that are leaders of our or managers of our organizations, where we sometimes get voluntold. And so we have to fulfill those expectations, but we can also maybe share with a manager or leader, look, I also have these talents and I'm happy to work in this field, or, I want to develop these talents, or I want to develop this skill set. Can I also align with this part of the project or this part of the process and see if I can grow and develop my talents in that capacity as well? Most of the time that works. Occasionally you're going to encounter people who may not be open to that, but in my experience, 9 times out of 10, you'll find someone who's like, yeah, because if you're going to, take on more work or do that servant leadership, often people are very open to doing that. And then you can really check off that box of the things that you're voluntold or you're required to do, but also maybe find that space where you can help grow your talents or develop your talents or lean into your talents and skill set. Leaders prioritize people, managers prioritize systems and structures, absolutely. And that goes back to managing by personality or leading by personality, because everybody is different. Where managers are like, let's get fit into the system and the structure to achieve the goals. Leaders reflect action, managers reflect title and positionality, right? One thing that one of the best leaders I had, where she was the dean of our department, but you would never know that she was the dean because she did not lean into her title or her positionality. She often referred to us as colleagues. And when I was over our student workers, I referred to them as colleagues because I remembered what it felt like to have a person who was in a high position when I was an undergraduate student, and that person referred to us as colleagues. And I always felt so special. And I thought that was wonderful. And it felt like, wow, this person sees me as an important part of this structure or this organization. And I loved that. And I never forgot that. And so I think that's something that we can also do as well in leading into that action and not necessarily leaning into the title or positionality. So one consideration to think, good managers demonstrate leadership. and good leaders should understand management. It's a delicate process, right, of understanding when we need to lean into one or the other. And it's not a, like all leaders have to have this and all managers are this. There's, fluidity that comes into that. But one of the best characteristics is good managers demonstrate leadership, and good leadership should understand management. And those are skills that are developed over time. Are there any questions, comments? Anybody have any feedback on that?
I wanted to raise a verbal comment if I could. I really appreciate that consideration you left because as each of these points were going, I kept going back and forth like between that binary of leadership and management. And something that I wanted to ask that this point spoke to is that for me, it feels like, both a leader and a manager, they need that exchange, right? Because in my experience, sometimes you can have leadership where everything is so high up in the big picture that there's a disconnect with the kind of realities of making things happen. And on the flip side, I think when you're in a management perspective, you can be kind of so or even too close, right, to the one particular thing or the nuts and bolts that the larger purpose and the why and the other context behind it can be missing. So I was like wrestling with that a little bit as y'all were going through. So I just appreciate that consideration because for me, it's always felt like you do need a little bit of both, right? Both things are really important, but from what I'm hearing they kind of manifest in different ways or like they have different strengths. So I thought that was really cool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Appreciate that. Anyone else? Let me check the chat as well.
Nope, I think we're good. So we can
Okay,
go
great.
ahead and we'll keep it moving. And we did promise this, so I did want to take some time. You heard servant leadership earlier, and there are a few other ones along with servant leadership that we wanted to introduce you to. As you know, as you've heard, there are a lot of theories that have been developed over time. And so we're going to go ahead and cover a few of them now. One is the great man theory. This is one that has been in existence for a very long time. And this was that myth that we talked about earlier, the idea that people are born leaders and as a result they have specific traits that would make them great leaders. It's not as prominent as it used to be, but it still is reflected in a lot of literature. Another one that you may have experienced is called transactional leadership and it frames the interactions that occur between leaders and followers as exchanges, and they're tied to rewards and tied to penalties. In many cases, what you may see a manager or supervisor doing by default is more transactional in nature. And it's one where you do this and therefore you will get that. But in terms of any of the next level work that we were talking about, you're not going to see as much of that. It's very much input output. One that you've probably seen and heard about is called transformational leadership. And there have been a number of different scholars that have written about this. James McGregor Burns is one you saw. Bass is another one. Kuz and Posner, if any of you are familiar with the leadership challenges or the leadership challenge, this is one that gets a lot of attention. And so much of it is rooted in having concern for people as well as keeping them motivated and also giving them a clear vision that they are tied into in order to accomplish goals. This is probably the one that gets the most attention overall. I've seen the number of folks say, I'm a transformational leader. And so this is really what they are talking about. One that Christy mentioned earlier that's related is called servant leadership. And this was done by Bruce Greenleaf. And it's similar to transformational leadership, but it's deeply invested in the well-being of your followers and those that are being served. It was originated from a book called Journey to the East, which is a fairly old book, and then Greenleaf created the leader as servant as well, and that's become its own sort of theory in terms of how leaders should be treating their followers. There are also models where it's not just rooted in one person, and those are typically called shared leadership. And that's where the influence exists across multiple individuals in order to achieve specific goals. Then there is another theory that's called leader member exchange. And the actual work is your interactions between each person. And depending on the output of that interaction, it may entitle them to more trust more influence with individuals, but it's all based in the individual dynamics that occur and what the quality of each of those are. And then one last one I wanted to share was done by Heifetz, and it's called adaptive leadership. And ultimately, it considers a lot of the different things that leaders do as being technical features. And what happens in these cases is that as individuals are going through each process, they have to look at the work from different perspectives. In fact, Heifetz calls it taking a view from the balcony. We talked earlier about 30,000 feet. It's very similar to that, that you're moving between the balcony, but then the ground floor. And so you're looking at the actual work from different perspectives. And based off of that, you may make adjustments based off of the feedback and also what circumstances that you're seeing change as well. Now, we've talked about all of these, but one point I wanted to make is that when it comes to leadership, one of the big suggestions that Northhouse makes, one of my favorite quotes from him, is that not everyone is locked into one form. In fact, you may find that you need to shift between different approaches to leadership depending on what the circumstances are. So in certain cases, you may find that for a person you're starting, you have to demonstrate transactional leadership. But then as trust builds, perhaps it moves more into something more transformative in nature. Or perhaps you start exhibiting servant leadership, but then from there you may move over to more of a shared leadership model. So it's not necessarily one that you're locked into, but a really good student leadership not only is aware of them, but is prepared to pivot between each of them as needed. So very quickly, Chrissy, I'm going to ask you, since we're starting to run a little short on time, of these, which stands out the most to you?
Well, I've already said servant leadership focuses on the well-being of those being served. And then also, I would say shared leadership, very, very important as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I did want to also talk specifically about higher education and leadership. You may have heard earlier that I talked about how leadership may look different in different industries. Well, higher education is no different. And the thing that I've found that you may also be aware of is that the exact frameworks for how leaders are elevated can vary a lot by institution. So I did want to provide these graphics just to give an example of that. Here you have 6 different institutions and you have 6 different models. And we haven't even gotten to the UC core competencies, but that would be another framework. But the basic point is that each location tends to have their own sort of model for how they choose to recognize and elevate their leaders. And so I just wanted to give this as a quick example of that. However, I did want to also point out that despite the fact you see these different models, there are certain common features that most of these models will speak to some extent. One of which would be communication, but also your capacity to build trust as well as relationships, understanding the organization's complexity, but then also the ability to include others, understanding people as well as the organizational culture, your ability to regulate yourself. And now I might constitute that as being more along the lines of emotional intelligence, but some degree of self-regulation is another one that comes up fairly often. Your ability to develop and execute strategy, and then ultimately talking about how you create the vision and the results. So you may see some overlap there with a lot of the things that we shared earlier. And then the last thing I wanted to share specifically related to higher education and leadership is that there have been some individuals who also tried to create grand models for what it means to lead at a higher education institution. Smith and Wolverton is one of the most prominent ones that I recall. And what they did is they framed leadership into 5 different domains. And so I did want to share those with all of you as well. One is your capacity for analytical work, your ability to effectively communicate. Again, probably seeing some overlap here. Your knowledge of matters pertaining to students and student affairs. Also your behavioral capacities. Then finally, your capacity for external relations. So overall, with this study, what they found is that a lot of the things leaders were doing generally fit into one of those 5 buckets. And so again, it might just be a situation where you see a lot of alignment with some of the other things that we share. But that's what a lot of things look like right now as it relates to leading in the higher education capacity. I will go ahead and pass it over to Christy.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly because we're running a little short on time. I apologize for that. But Smith and Wolverton talked about analytical communication, student affairs, behavioral, and external relations. And then the common competencies of these leaders is communication. We talked about this, relationship and trust building, organizational complexity, understanding that that's really important. I think that's important for all of you. Being part of a pretty big organization, right? And the complexity, and not just at UC Berkeley, but then also part of the UC organization as a whole. People and culture, self-regulation, strategy, vision, and results, right? So those are the common competencies that we think of when we think about our leaders and what the ideal leaders have. And then we talked about these leadership traits: self-awareness, respect, compassion, vision, communication, learning agility, collaboration, integrity, courage, gratitude, and resilience. So what patterns do you see between these two, these different theories, but these traits? Anybody want to share?
I'll start. The biggest one that I see here is behavioral as well as communication, that those two seem to be a thread across all of these.
Thank you, Dennis. Anyone else? I'm going to check the chat as well. Or any patterns that you've seen in leaders that you've worked with or engaged with that had patterns? Oh, relationships. Yes, absolutely. Super important, right? Goes back to the embracing people and being part of people and the culture. Everything is about relationships and people. Yeah, I love this. So important, right? To make sure that we have that. We don't forget. Great leaders don't forget that we're people, right? That it's not just about that system and the organization, that people make up that system and organization. And we can't forget that. Excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, I see we're down to the last few minutes, so we'll skip our exercise, but we will make sure we share that link with y'all later on. So, Chrissy, I think you got the next one.
Okay, so let's talk about leading from where you are. What does that look like? How can you become a leader or expand upon being a leader from where you are? So here are some ideas and some recommendations. So develop your influence through building your communication skills, organizational knowledge, and relationships, right? We just talked about some of the feedback that we heard was about relationships from being the leaders, and communication skills, and thinking about people that maybe you may not have engaged with, or that may not be in your direct organization or your direct office, but think about how you can broaden that and work with folks and think about different communication skills, organizational knowledge beyond your department or beyond your area. What does that look like? And relationships. One of the things you can do is think about, if you are thinking about that servant leadership or transformational relationship, what is it that moves you? What is it that burns your compassion, that makes you feel whole? Think about there, and that's where you can look and think about exploring where you can start to lead. Seek relationships in and across your office, division, and campus. Absolutely. And if that seems intimidating to you, think about friends or acquaintances that you have in other departments, and maybe going to coffee or lunch, or thinking about where you can serve together, and things that really fill your cup, I think is really important in doing that. Find opportunities to collaborate with others in different settings. If you're part of any alumni groups or any volunteer groups outside of UC Berkeley, what can you do to collaborate with others in different settings? And that's where you can meet people maybe that you would have never interacted or worked with before. And I think that is something that's really important, is developing that diversity in our communities and leadership skills and working with different people. identify challenges, and take proactive ownership of them. We've all experienced being part of organizations where things are broken or there's deficits or there's a disconnect. What can we do to help repair that and be part of that solution? Lean into opportunities to learn domains outside of your own, such as student, academic affairs, athletics, and others. And this is kind of where I started with working in staff assembly. I ended up volunteering to be on the transportation committee, and I was working in admissions, and I worked with folks in facilities and transportation that I would have never interacted with, but it was awesome. And I learned, what does it take? These people do amazing work, especially if like there's a big event on campus. Facilitating that and the parking and getting people safely to their cars or transportation and doing all of that. It's amazing. I learned so much more about what it takes, and I gained a new respect for that. And it was awesome, as well as they interacted with me and realized that admissions is not just traveling around the world and like having great dinners and all that. There's a science and a method to that, and to not just building a class, but building a community, right, for our university. So it was an amazing opportunity. And this leads right into find moments to teach and learn from others, and looking at what that takes, and what and this goes back to thinking about the skill sets that we have. And it's okay to low key brag and say, you know, these are the skill sets that I have and I can bring this. But what do I want to learn? What are some things that I want to develop as a person, and who has that skill set? You know, and working with folks. And this is one thing that Dennis and I did, is he reached out to me, and we ended up talking and chatting, and learned that we both have incredible skill sets and learned from each other to develop from each other. And he's the one who encouraged me to go and do this, which I never would have done without him. And so again, a great leader to developing those skills. Find experiences that will help you learn processes and structures. Really important. And saying, you know what, okay, I know this process, this structure in my department, but what is it in another department or another organization? Or what does that look like? And you'll find, if you just ask people, people are often very willing to share their experiences, their skills and talents, and help you develop. It's just amazing. It really will fill your cup. At least it does for me, when I realize how many wonderful people that will be willing to help you when you vocalize your desire to lead within your network and let others help you achieve it. It's awesome. It really is. And sometimes it's like amazing. I'm like, wow, I can't believe that person who's in this amazing position or in this leadership position would be willing to help me or want to invest in me. It's amazing. You get a little imposter syndrome, you know, that's perfectly natural. But then eventually you're like, wow, this is amazing. And then paying it forward, I think, is really important, where people will start to look at you as a leader and think about the talents and skill set that you have. So helping others lead from where they are. Actively encourage your team to learn and lead. Super important. Just by merely expressing it can make a big difference. That can be transformational leadership from somebody else's point of view. Share opportunities for individuals to develop their influence. Absolutely. Say, hey, Dennis, you know what? I'm going to such and such meeting or this event. Would you be interested in coming with me, or would you be interested in representing our department to do that? And more often than not, the person will say yes. And if they seem a little shy or a little introverted, you know, these are the things that the information I'm looking for. If you could kind of go there and bring back this information and then present it to the team or share it to the team, those are great opportunities. Give individual consideration to your colleagues. We have a lot, we work with amazing people, who have amazing skill sets and talents. Let's lean into that and talk with them about that. What are the things that they're bringing to the table? Be a coach, not a critic. And also on the flip side, be coachable, right? And I think that's something that's really important with being a leader, is to be coachable. We don't have all the answers. We don't know everything. I don't want to know everything. The older I get, the more I realize the less I know, and I'm perfectly comfortable with it. I love that. But be a coach and say, you know what? As I say, the compliment sandwich, start with what you did well. This is it. You know, these are areas that, you know, or ask questions, you know, tell me what was your approach, or what you were thinking when you approached this way, or approach the problem this way, or your solution. I think that's really, really important. Leverage professional development policy to give people space to continue in learning, which you all are doing by being here right now, which is awesome. Create opportunities for your team to build organizational knowledge. Absolutely. Again, that goes, I think, presentations are important, sharing information, doing research. We work at a huge research institution, right? One of the best in the world. So research is in the DNA of this. Let's continue to do that, but let's think about it not just from an academic point of view, but from our organizational point of view. Do not hoard information. Be a source, not a gatekeeper. Absolutely. And that, I think, also goes back to that transformational or servant leadership, shared leadership. If you have information, absolutely be a source, but also communicate that you're open to being a source and people will come to you. Encourage your team to learn and grow by utilizing performance evaluations. Super important. And positive performance evaluations, right? With opportunities to grow and develop, not just criticize.
And in recognition of the fact that we're over, we're going to jump around a little bit through a couple of these. So just to very quickly mention that you have a number of opportunities on campus that you can engage. UC Berkeley has a number of great staff organizations that you can choose from. And plus, your local HR policy does encourage participation in these things, whether staff assembly, Lavender Cow, BSFO, I know them all. There are many ways you can find a way to get involved. And also, if you have a community that you think needs to be created, then don't be afraid to take a lead on that. There are also campus committees that you can be a part of as well, which will give you the chance to build your networks and build relationships. And then finally, keeping in mind that there are many opportunities to continue to learn. We talk a lot about some of the things, trust, communication. I know that People and Culture has a fairly robust amount of information on this, so you can continue to learn in that way. And then also, like I mentioned before, there may be some opportunities to learn just from where you are. And if there is something you think can be done, then I would absolutely encourage you to take advantage of that. Chrissy, I'm going to just quickly skip a little bit more. Just a quick recap of what we've covered over the past hour plus. You have a few closing questions here that I encourage all of you to think about when you have this slide. And then the last thing that I did want to share is that there are many opportunities to continue learning. And you also have this in the last slide as well. And then finally, like always, Berkeley has a number of great resources that we've alluded to. And so I would just say, as much as you can, take advantage of these opportunities to continue to learn and grow, and also to encourage others to as well. And the closing point I would make is leadership is a practice. What that means is you are continuously going to have these opportunities to learn and refine it. Anyone who truly is invested in this is finding every opportunity to continue growing. And hopefully, I hope that each of you will have that opportunity and you started today. So on that note, thank you all for hanging out with us and giving us a few extra minutes, and hope that this was helpful for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Christy. Just really appreciate you both sharing your time and your expertise here today and demonstrating your shared leadership by co-presenting and your servant leadership by really your generosity in being here and facilitating this great content for us to be able to recognize how we are leaders and how we can lead from where we are. So thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. I will send out the materials within the next 24 hours, if not by the end of day today. All right, well, have a great afternoon and take care.
Thank you. Bye.